Now, the startling but not so surprising news that Arabtec, one of the UAE's largest construction companies that is fully government owned, has actually gone into liquidation. They've voted to liquidate the company after suffering around $213 million in losses first part of this year. But the problem is going to be not so much this company being dispersed and liquidated and made insolvent, but the knock-on effects that that's going to have to a lot of individuals and a lot of companies who are relying on compensation from Arabtec. They're going to be expecting payment for their services. They're going to have companies that are set up just to service this giant. Essentially, we have individuals, workers who have, will suddenly become unemployed. So this is actually quite a disaster for the UAE economy. And interestingly, they are filing for insolvency and they have that option available to them. They're a UAE government-owned company. And at the moment, I think they've got something like $23 billion worth of construction underway. And I assume that that's going to be brought to a decline like we saw with Nakheel and several other government-owned entities back in the 2009 crash. So what we're going to see from this is essentially this company is not going to want to pay a lot of contractors, a lot of business arrangements that they've had, a lot of individuals, workers, and we're going to see people at great risk themselves of going bankrupt. But the thing is, they're not going to have the bankruptcy laws open to them. The bankruptcy laws, the insolvency procedures, they're going to be used by UAE banks, by UAE government-owned construction companies, but are they going to be used by the entrepreneurs who have gone to the UAE and partnered or done business with this government giant? Are they going to be able to use these same bankruptcy laws when they're not paid by this government giant? And the answer is pretty much no. The insolvency laws, the bankruptcy laws that have been brought in the UAE have been ineffective for the people who really need them, for the individuals and the companies who have been relying on income promised by the government and not given to them. They're not going to be able to use these bankruptcy laws. So what's going to happen to them? Well, as in other cases, as in 2009, and as we've seen even in just normal business times over the past 10 years, we're going to see these business failing to meet their own commitments. They're not going to be receiving that income from the government, that payment for services rendered. The contractual obligations are not going to be given to them. They're not going to be paid. So they're in turn not going to be able to pay down their supply lines. They're not going to be able to pay their suppliers, their other businesses that they have agreements with, perhaps their bank loans that they've taken out on the basis of contracts with the UAE government. So that's going to put them into debt. That's going to put the individuals who operate the company into personal issues, because they're going to be personally liable for the performance of the company if the company cannot meet its debts with the bank, its payments with the bank, because the UAE government hasn't been able to do the same to them and they've been relying on them. If they're not paid, they can't pay, but they have no way to get out of this mess. So the banks are going to come after them as individuals. The companies are going to be lost, all of the assets are going to be lost, but the individuals risk being jailed actually in the UAE. Now, it's still a criminal offense to bounce a check in the UAE. But of course, as a business owner and as someone who's dealing with construction projects and in this industry, you're going to be writing a lot of checks. You're going to be writing a check for supplies, and that check could be quite large. If they're a larger company and they've written many checks, actually, they've got many different suppliers, and suddenly their contracts are cancelled by the UAE government, they're still going to have to honour those checks, but they're not going to have the payment from the government. So that means they're going to default, the bank's going to come after them, and every check that they've written can warrant several years in prison, and that's per check. So some of the people who are going to be affected by this insolvency in the UAE are people who don't have those protections afforded to them by the UAE government. And this has been a major failing on the UAE's part to attract investors, to attract entrepreneurs into the country, because as soon as things go wrong, they're not protected and they're sent to the wolves, they're sent to prison. That people have been actually sentenced to something like 40 years or even more in prison, because imagine you have 10 checks that you've written to suppliers and you expected payment from the government didn't pay you, you can't pay those suppliers. Every check that you've written is worth 3 years in prison. That's 30 years right there. And it's actually easier to get a pardon for a violent crime than it is for a financial crime. So there's no excuse, there's no insolvency excuse, there's no bankruptcy excuse. If the UAE government didn't pay you, you cannot rely on that for protection in the courts. It's black and white, you're going to go to jail. Then we're going to have a mass exodus of people, because I think now people are more aware that the UAE government does put them in this position, and as soon as things goes bad, they will end up in jail. So a lot of people are aware of that. Thankfully to the media over the past 10 years and the work that we've done, a lot of people do foresee this scenario and do see it coming. So I think we're going to see a lot of entrepreneurs, a lot of investors just cutting their losses and getting out of the country. But that in turn is going to see a rise in Interpol notices, because anyone who leaves the country who owes any amount of money is going to be seen by whoever they owe money to as a fraudster, essentially. And that same organisation who reports them to Interpol is going to be the UAE government. And highly likely that it's actually going to be this Arabtec company who has not paid their supplier, because it's a great way for them to get money back. You know, essentially they're losing money for the country, and this is a terrible shame and embarrassment. But they're going to try and recoup as much as they can of their losses, even if they've been profitable for the last 10 years and they've had a great time making billions of dollars. If they see people leaving and owing them money, they're going to put them on Interpol and they're going to try and get as much as they can. Let's say they can retrieve 1 million from 10 people. They're going to put 100 people on there just to get those 10 people. So this is what we saw with Nakheel. There's a lot of people that they put on Interpol, even though the exact problem that they're reporting them to Interpol for was caused by them and their failure to pay that external contractor or that individual. So the other thing we're going to see is mass loss of employment, economic downturn, and the impacts of that across several sectors and industries. And that, again, is going to cause a lot of people, there's a lot of Indians going to be involved in this construction industry. There's a lot of Europeans and British nationals who are going to have these deals with Arabtec, who are going to be affected by this. And they're going to face... well, if they stay in the country, they're going to face the entire loss of their savings, the work that they've committed for the past however long they've been there. Some of them have been there 20 years, so they're not going to see this coming. But they're going to face the complete loss of their life savings, the complete loss of their income. They're going to face upheaval in their family. They're going to have to relocate, potentially. If they stay in the UAE, they face prison for debts that they weren't able to prevent and through no fault of their own. If they leave the UAE, they could face an Interpol red notice, or alternatively, they may face civil action in the UK for any debts that they may have left behind, or if they've failed to pay a supplier because of the onward effect. And they're also going to face some very, very aggressive banks coming after them. Now, the banks, as you might have seen in the media, they're facing difficult times as well, and that would be expected with this crisis. We have banks merging, and are they becoming softer in these times? Absolutely not. Now, we're still, our client base of people who owe funds to banks, we thought that they might get a little bit of a relaxing time at the moment, a little bit of leniency essentially from the banks, and they did for a very short period of time, but the banks have come in very aggressively now. And in a sense, it's their own survival as well. They want to go in even harder because they're having a hard time. So I think what we're going to see is the banks are going to be very confident that individuals who default on them are not going to be able to pay them, that they're going to give up essentially and use coronavirus and economic crisis as their excuse. So the banks are going to go in very hard, knowing that if they don't, the individuals are probably not going to be able to reach a private solution with them. So again, we're going to see people going to jail over this. We're going to see no bankruptcy protection for those people other than the UAE government. We're going to see people on Interpol's databases again, and we're going to see people harassed, intimidated, chased abroad for payments owed to these companies. But we're not going to see the UAE government paying these people that they've promised to pay, that they were contracted to pay. And we're going to see complete abandonment of responsibility by the UAE government, and they're going to walk away from this, but having caused a lot of people a lot of grief, and some of them are going to lose their entire life savings, some of them are going to lose their freedom. So all we can say at this point is if you're going to face a default, if there's a possibility that you're going to be put in a precarious position, in a difficult situation financially in the UAE, you should leave. And doing so, at least the only risk then is that you're going to be on the Interpol database, or that you're going to have to fight this through a civil court internationally. But while you stay in the UAE in this time, it's not an excuse that the UAE government did not pay you what they owed you. It's not an excuse that's going to be taken into account by the court. The courts are not going to appreciate your situation. They're going to convict you. They're going to sentence you black and white, and there's going to be no real possibility of any release anytime soon. And it can compile. If you're accused of one crime, the fact that you've lost your passport and you can't work and you've lost your visa is going to cause you to default on even more positions, more suppliers, or more banks, and it's just going to cause a real downward spiral. So you have to assess, is now a good time to leave? Am I going to get caught up? Because as soon as one case is open, you're at great risk that you're going to actually end up in prison, and there's nothing you can do to stop that downward spiral. So tough times ahead, but thanks for listening, guys, and just try to keep yourself safe and keep yourself out of prison. If you've got any concerns that you're going to be listed on Interpol, or that you're going to be chased by an aggressive bank for debt, do let us know, and we can give you some advice on sort of preventing the escalation of these situations. But thanks for listening, guys, and speak to you soon.